The morning Nellie Shelton decided she was done letting other people write the terms of her life. The sun had barely cracked the horizon over the dusty, wide-open flats of Calhoun County, Texas, and she was already sitting at her kitchen table with a pen, an inkwell, and a sheet of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times it had gone soft at the creases. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Red Rock Crossing had grown just enough to feel crowded, but not enough to feel safe, which was a peculiar kind of uncomfortable that Nellie had come to know like the back of her own calloused hand. She was 26 years old, had buried one father, one mother, and one husband in the span of 3 years, and she had learned, the hard way, the way that leaves marks, that the world had a habit of making decisions about a woman without ever asking her opinion. She would not let that happen again. So she dipped the pen, and she began to write. The paper had started as an idea formed some weeks back, after old Jonas Pratt from the feed store had come around suggesting, very politely, that a widow woman running 40 acres of land and a small cattle operation alone was not a practical arrangement, and that perhaps she ought to consider remarrying. He had said it the way men always said it, like he was doing her a favor, like the suggestion itself was a gift she ought to be grateful for. Nellie had thanked him for his concern and closed the door so quietly that the latch barely made a sound, which was the most dangerous kind of quiet she possessed. She had thought about it for weeks. Not about Jonas Pratt's suggestion, which she had no intention of honoring, but about something deeper, something that had been scratching at the inside of her chest like a bird trying to find its way out of a chimney. She had been married before. She had loved Thomas Shelton with a genuine and uncomplicated affection, and when the fever had taken him in the winter of 1880, she had grieved him honestly and completely. But she had also, in the long, quiet months that followed, begun to understand something she had not fully understood while he was alive. Her life had reorganized itself entirely around him, around his plans, his land, his name, his decisions, and she had accepted that arrangement because it was the only one anyone had ever offered her. She would not accept that arrangement again. So she wrote. She wrote slowly and carefully, with the kind of deliberateness that meant each word was earning its place on the page. She wrote 5 things, and then she read them back to herself, and she added 2 more, and then she read those 2, and when she was satisfied that every line said exactly what she meant and nothing it did not, she set the pen down. She did not know who she was writing them for. That part she had not figured out yet, but she knew that whoever it was, he would read them before she agreed to a single thing, and he would either accept them or he would be shown the door. The terms were not outrageous. She was not a woman who asked for the moon. She asked for the right to make decisions about her own land. She asked to keep her name, not because she was attached to Shelton particularly, but because she had learned that a name was a kind of armor, and she was not prepared to go unarmed again. She asked that any man who came to call on her do the actual work alongside her, not above her. She asked to be consulted before any major decision was made that touched her property or her livelihood. She asked to be spoken to honestly, even when the truth was uncomfortable, because she had had enough comfortable lies to last a lifetime. She asked for patience, because she was not a woman who warmed quickly, and she needed to be met where she was rather than pulled toward where someone else wanted her to be. And the last term, the 7th, was the one she had added after the most consideration, and it said simply, "I will not be managed, I will be partnered." She folded the paper and put it in the small wooden box on the shelf above the fireplace, next to a dried sprig of sage and a faded photograph of her mother standing in front of a house that no longer existed, and she went outside to start the morning's work. The cattle did not care about her terms. They needed water and feeding and checking, and 2 of them had gotten themselves tangled in a section of fence line that had buckled under the weight of last week's windstorm, and the morning disappeared into the particular honest exhaustion that comes from physical labor done well. By the time she came back inside for coffee and a piece of cornbread, it was nearly noon and her boots were carrying half of the county's red dirt, and she was too tired to think about the future or the paper in the box or anything except the way the coffee smelled when it hit the mug. She did not know that 3 miles to the north, a man named Ezekiel Walker was riding into Redrock Crossing on a dun horse with a cracked saddle and a letter in his coat pocket that had been written by a land agent in San Antonio, offering him work as a ranch hand on 40 acres belonging to a widow woman who, according to the letter, was in urgent need of experienced help and not much interested in pleasantries. Ezekiel Walker was 29 years old and built like someone who had been doing hard work since before he was old enough to have opinions about it, which was more or less the truth. He had grown up in Central Texas, the son of a blacksmith father and a schoolteacher mother, and he had learned from his father how to be useful with his hands, and from his mother how to read and think carefully, and both of those things had served him well and also made him slightly uncomfortable in most of the places he had lived, because useful, quiet men who thought carefully were often mistaken for something either simpler or more complicated than they actually were. He had worked cattle drives in his younger years, had spent time in Abilene and Dodge City during the years those places were still the roaring, chaotic heart of the cattle trade, had watched men drink themselves sideways and shoot each other over things that seemed important in the moment, and did not seem important at all in the reckoning afterward. He had not been above any of it, but he had never been the worst of it either, and somewhere around 25, he had gotten tired of the constant motion of that life and started looking for something with roots, something that stayed in one place and asked him to stay with it. He had tried working for a larger operation out near Brackettville, but the foreman there was a man named Cord who managed his workers the way some people manage furniture, by moving them around to suit his own arrangements without any consideration of whether the furniture might have preferences. And Ezekiel had lasted 8 months before the itch under his skin got too loud to ignore. He had left on a Tuesday morning with everything he owned in his saddlebag and a general sense of direction rather than a specific destination, and the letter from the land agent had come through a friend of a friend and had found him in the town of Mineral Springs just as he was weighing his options. He had read it twice and written back with his availability and his references, and a short note that said he was not a man who needed to be told twice and not a man who would pretend to agree with something he did not. And if neither of those qualities were useful to the widow woman in Redrock Crossing, he would understand entirely. The land agent had written back to say that sounded fine to him, and that the widow woman could speak for herself when Ezekiel arrived. So here he was, 3 miles out, riding through the kind of Texas morning that made a man aware of his own smallness in the best possible way, the sky enormous and pale blue above the scrubland and the red earth, the air still carrying the cool edge of night along the ground even as the sun pressed down from above, and he was thinking about the kind of work the land would need, and the kind of employer the widow woman might be, and he was not thinking about anything beyond that. Because he was a practical man, and he had learned to take things in the order they arrived. He came into the yard of the Shelton property just past 1 in the afternoon. He noted the condition of the fence line before he noted anything else, which was both a professional habit and a personal one, because a fence line told you something true about the operation it enclosed. The fence here was mostly sound, but had 2 sections that had buckled. One he had ridden past on the eastern side, one visible from the yard near the water trough, and the wood was old enough to need replacing rather than repairing in those spots. He filed that away. He swung down from the horse and stood in the yard and waited, because walking up to a widow woman's door uninvited was not a thing he was prepared to do. The door opened after a moment, and Nellie Shelton came out onto the porch with a coffee cup in one hand and a look on her face that was not hostile but was not welcoming either, which he thought was exactly the right look for a woman who had been working alone all morning and had no particular reason yet to trust an unfamiliar man who had shown up in her yard. "You would be Mr. Walker," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Ezekiel Walker." "I believe Mr. Holt at the land office communicated my arrival." "He did," she said. She looked at him with the same appraising attention she had given the sections of fence line, not unkindly but completely without softness, cataloging what she saw. He was tall and broad across the shoulders and dark from the sun, with an honest face that did not try to arrange itself into anything appealing. He held his hat in both hands and met her eyes without either aggression or excess. She noted all of this the way she noted the condition of her cattle, because it was information and information was useful. "I have work that needs doing," she said. "More of it than I have been able to manage alone. Mr. Holt tells me you have experience with cattle and fence work and general ranch operation." "That is accurate," he said. "He also tells me you are not given to staying in one place very long." "I have not found the right place yet," he said, and there was no defensiveness in it, just the plain statement of fact. She considered that. "Come inside," she said. "I will tell you what the work is, and you can tell me whether you are willing and capable of doing it, and we will proceed from there." He tied the horse at the post and followed her inside, and she poured him coffee without being asked, which he took as an indication that she was a practical woman who did not see the point in withholding basic hospitality while she was making up her mind about something. She talked about the land with the fluency of someone who had learned it by necessity rather than by choice, and had come out the other side of that education genuinely knowledgeable. She knew the fence line's weak points by section. She knew which cattle were her strongest and which were costing her more in feed than they were likely to return. She knew the water sources and their reliability through different seasons, and had observations about the soil in the eastern pasture that suggested she had been paying close attention to it for some time. He listened without interrupting, which was easy because she was interesting to listen to. When she finished, she looked at him and said, "The wage is fair. It is not generous because this is not yet a prosperous operation. It may become one. Board is in the small structure behind the main house, which is adequate but not comfortable. Meals are taken here and I cook, and I am not particularly interested in praise for the cooking or complaints about it. I am interested in work done well and honestly and without my having to ask for it twice." "Those are all reasonable expectations," he said. "They are," she agreed. "Do you have questions?" He did have one. "You mentioned in your communication through Mr. Holt that you were not much interested in pleasantries. I want to be clear about what you mean by that because I am not an unpleasant man, but I am also not a man who performs cheerfulness as a professional courtesy." She looked at him for a long moment and something in her face shifted, so briefly and so slightly that he almost missed it, like a door opening just a crack and then closing again. "That is precisely what I mean," she said. "I mean I am not interested in pretense. I am interested in honest dealing." "Good," he said. "Then we understand each other." "We will see," she said, which was, he thought, the correct answer. He started work the next morning. He fixed the fence first, because it was the most pressing structural problem, and he did it correctly, replacing the buckled sections rather than patching them, which took longer but was worth the time. Nellie came out mid-morning and watched him work for a few minutes without saying anything, and then said, "You are replacing rather than patching." "Patching would hold through summer and fail again in the fall," he said. "Replacing now costs more time but less work over the following year." She nodded once and went back to what she had been doing. He took that as approval and kept working. The days fell into a rhythm quickly, because both of them were rhythmic people in the way that people who do physical work naturally become, organized by the logic of what needs doing and when, by the particular sequence of morning chores and midday check-ins and afternoon labor and evening quiet. He worked hard and he worked smart, and she noticed both. He did not try to take over decisions that were hers to make, which she also noticed. He asked before he changed anything that was not obviously his to change, and he explained his reasoning clearly when he did ask, and he accepted her answer when she gave it even when he did not fully agree. That happened for the first time about 3 weeks in, when he suggested moving the smaller herd to the northern pasture because the grass there was stronger in the spring season, and she said she preferred to keep them in the southern pasture where they could be watched from the house, and he said he understood but wanted her to know the grass quality difference would affect their condition by summer, and she said she would think about it. He did not mention it again. He waited. 2 days later, she came to where he was working and said, "You may move them to the northern pasture. I will walk the perimeter of that fence line tomorrow to assess what reinforcement it needs before we make the move." He said, "I already walked it. The eastern side needs 2 new posts and the south gate latch needs replacing. I can have both done by the end of tomorrow." She looked at him again with that appraising attention, and this time the door opened a little wider before it closed. "All right," she said. "Thursday, then." By the end of the first month, the property looked meaningfully better than it had when he arrived, and Nellie knew it, and she told him so in the direct, uncomplicated way she had of acknowledging things that were true without wrapping them in ceremony. "The place is looking better," she said over supper one evening. "The work you have done has been sound. The place has good bones," he said. "The land is good land. It needed attention, not transformation." She was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table threw a warm circle of light between them, and outside the windows the Texas evening settled into its long purple-blue dusk, and the cattle were quiet in the northern pasture where they had been moved 3 weeks ago and were, as he had predicted, looking markedly stronger for it. "My husband," she said carefully, "was not a man who knew how to work land. He was a good man, but he came from a merchant family, and the land was something he had acquired with the intention of learning about it, and he did not have the time to learn as much as the land needed him to know. I have spent the last 2 years learning what he did not get to." Ezekiel did not say anything immediately because she had not finished yet, and he could tell she had not finished. "I am not looking to be rescued," she said. "I am looking for someone who can work alongside me and let me do the same." "I understand that," he said, "and I want to be clear. I am here because the work is worth doing and you are a fair employer. I am not here to rescue anyone." She looked at him, and this time the door opened and stayed open for a noticeable moment. "Good," she said, and she passed him the bread, and they ate the rest of the supper in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who did not need to fill silence with noise. The town of Redrock Crossing had opinions about the arrangement, because small towns in 1882 had opinions about everything, especially about widowed women and the hired men who worked for them, and those opinions were generally not charitable. Nellie had been aware of this from the moment she had decided to hire help rather than remarry, and she had decided, with the same deliberate clarity with which she made all of her decisions, that the town's opinions were the town's business and not hers. She did her business in town as she always had, buying supplies at the general store run by a man named August Beeler who was decent and minded his own affairs, and getting her mail at the post office, and occasionally stopping at the doctor's office when the doctor, a gray-haired woman named Clara Voss who had come west from Ohio, and was one of the few people in town whose judgment Nellie fully respected, had something worth talking about. Clara Voss had read widely and thought carefully, and had opinions about medicine and botany, and the general condition of women in the American West that were both accurate and bracing, and Nellie found her company invigorating in the same way that cold well water is invigorating on a hot day. It was Clara who first said, in late June, sitting on the porch of her office with a cup of strong tea, "Your hired man has a good reputation forming. People speak well of his work anyway. What they say about the arrangement itself is less worth repeating. I imagine it is not particularly original," Nellie said. "It is not," Clara confirmed. "The usual suggestions that it is improper, that you are impractical, that a woman in your position ought to consider her standing in the community. My standing in the community, Nellie said, does not fix fence lines or improve the condition of cattle. Clara Voss laughed, a genuine laugh, not a polite one. No, it does not, she said. He does seem a genuinely decent sort from what I have seen. He came in last week to pick up something for a cut on his hand, wanted to make sure it was clean and dressed properly before it got worse. Men who take that kind of practical care with themselves are usually men who take that kind of practical care with other things too. Nellie had noticed the bandage on his hand. She had not commented on it because it had been wrapped cleanly and he had clearly dealt with it. But she had noticed. She told herself she was noticing in the way you notice things about a person who works for you, in the same way she noticed when the cattle were off their feed, or when the sky had that particular greenish tinge that meant a storm was building, because noticing was how you stayed ahead of problems. She told herself this, and she mostly believed it, and she filed the information about the bandage in the same place she had filed the information about how he asked before changing things and waited when she said she would think about it, and never tried to crowd the silence out of a room. The summer hit hard in July, the way Texas summers do, with a flat, relentless heat that baked everything down to its essential nature and left no room for pretense. The water in the creek that fed the northern pasture dropped by a third in 3 weeks, which was a problem Nellie had been monitoring and had a partial plan for, involving a series of channels she had sketched out in her notebook the previous winter based on observations she had made about the way the water moved in the wet season. She explained the plan to Ezekiel over the kitchen table one evening, unrolling her sketched map, and he looked at it carefully and did not say it was a bad plan, because it was not a bad plan, but he did point to one section of the proposed channel system and say that the grade there was slightly off and that the water would likely pool rather than run. "How do you know?" she asked, not defensively but with genuine curiosity. "The land drops east here," he said, pointing to the map. "Not much, but enough. If we shift the channel by about 15 feet to the south, we hit the natural grade and the water runs where we need it." She looked at the map and then looked out the window in the direction of the eastern pasture and then looked back at the map. "You are right," she said. "I did not account for that drop. It is a good plan," he said. "It just needs adjusting in one section." "Then we will adjust it," she said, and she picked up the pen and moved the line on the map, and he watched her do it with the pen moving with that same deliberate confidence with which she did everything, and something in his chest did something he had not given it permission to do. He kept that observation to himself, because he was a man who believed that feelings, like fence repairs, needed to be assessed carefully before acted on, and he was in no hurry. They built the channel system over the next 3 weeks, working in the early morning before the heat became the central fact of the day, digging and grading, and setting the stones that would guide the water. It was hard work, and they did it in companionable silence mostly, occasionally consulting, occasionally disagreeing and working through the disagreement with a directness that felt, to both of them, like something rare and worth protecting. By the time the first water ran through the completed system and spread into the northern pasture in a clean and satisfying flow, they were both standing at the head of the channel watching it go, and Nellie said, "Well, that works," with the quiet, deep satisfaction of someone who has solved a genuine problem, and Ezekiel said, "It does." And they stood there in the early morning watching the water run until the heat came on fully and drove them back to other work. The shift happened in August, as shifts often do, not in a single dramatic moment but in an accumulation of small moments that build up like water in a reservoir, until there is suddenly more of it than the container can quietly hold. It happened in a series of evenings when the heat held on past sundown and they sat on the porch after supper because the house was too warm to sit in comfortably, and they talked. Not about the work, though the work was present in the background of everything, but about other things, about the books she had read and the ones he had, about what she remembered of the years before she came west and what he had seen during his years on the cattle drives, about the things that had shaped them, and the things they had decided in response to being shaped. He told her about Abilene and Dodge City, about the chaos and the noise and the particular exhaustion of a life that never settled. He told her about a night in Dodge when he had watched a man younger than him get shot over nothing, over a card game that was not even honest to begin with, and how he had ridden out the next morning with the very clear feeling that he was done with that particular version of living. He did not dramatize any of it. He said it the way he said things, directly and without embellishment, and she listened without interrupting, which was the thing he had come to appreciate most about her, the quality of her attention. She told him about her parents, about growing up in East Texas before moving west, about the particular loneliness of being a girl who thought carefully in a world that did not have much use for girls who thought carefully, who always seemed to know things before she was supposed to know them and care about things that other girls her age had been told were not worth caring about. She told him about Thomas, about the good parts and the hard parts, and the way grief had rearranged her understanding of herself over the 2 years since he had died. She did not ask for sympathy, and he did not offer it in the empty way, but he listened with the same quality of attention she gave him, and when she finished he said, "He would be proud of what you have done with this place." And she looked at him for a long moment and said, "I think he would." And there was no more sadness in it than was appropriate, which is to say there was some sadness and also something else. By the end of August, Ezekiel Walker knew he was in love with Nellie Shelton, not in the careless, tumbling way of youth, but in the way of a man who has lived long enough to recognize the real thing when it comes along, and also to understand that the real thing requires care and patience and honesty, none of which could be rushed without damaging what they were supposed to protect. He did not say anything. He kept working. He kept being honest and direct and asking before he changed things, and he waited because he was a man who knew how to wait, and because he also knew that Nellie Shelton was not a woman who moved at anyone's pace but her own, and that the worst thing he could do was try to move her. In September, a man came to the property. His name was Wayland Prout, and he was a land speculator of the particular stripe that had been moving through this part of Texas for the last several years, identifying properties held by widows or struggling operators and making offers that were technically above the assessed value and actually well below the real worth of the land, because assessed value and real worth were two different numbers, and Wayland Prout knew how to use that gap. He arrived on a well-kept horse in clean clothes, and with the particular smooth confidence of a man who expected to be dealt with on his terms, and he asked for Mrs. Shelton and was received on the porch. Nellie sat in the chair she kept on the porch for exactly the kind of conversation she wanted to conduct at arm's length from her home, and she offered him nothing to drink, because he was not the kind of visitor who merited hospitality, and she listened to his offer with her hands folded in her lap and her face completely neutral. Ezekiel was working at the far end of the property when Prout arrived, but he saw the horse at the gate and made his way back slowly, not hurrying, not intruding, but making himself visible. Not as a threat exactly. As a fact, Prout made his offer. It was exactly what Nellie had expected, polished, reasonable-sounding, and structured in a way that made it seem generous while actually transferring a significant amount of value from her to him. He concluded with a kind of practiced sympathy about the difficulty of managing a property alone, which was the part she liked least. "I am not managing alone," she said, "and I am not selling." He adjusted slightly, the way such men do when the first approach fails, recalibrating for the next angle. He suggested that the work of developing the land fully would require capital she might not have, and that his offer included not just the purchase price but the promise of continued employment for any current workers. "Mr. Prout," she said, and her voice was not loud but it was very clear, "I have heard your offer and I have answered it. The answer is no. The land is not for sale." He looked at her for a moment, and then his eyes moved to where Ezekiel was now standing at the corner of the yard, Not close, not threatening, just there, leaning against the fence post with the easy stillness of a man who has nothing to prove. Prout reassessed the situation and concluded it had become inconvenient. He thanked her for her time in the smooth way of men who are not actually grateful and rode away. Nellie sat on the porch for a moment after he was gone, her hands still folded in her lap, looking at the road. Then she looked at Ezekiel. He had not moved, was still leaning at the fence post, his hat pushed back slightly on his head, waiting. "Thank you," she said. "I did not do anything," he said. "You were here," she said. That was enough. He came to eat supper that evening with the quiet feeling of a man who had been offered something unexpectedly valuable, something he had not asked for and had not earned by anything extraordinary, just by being present and being himself. And he understood that this was the thing that mattered, not doing something grand, but simply being someone who could be relied on to stand at a fence post when it was needed without being asked, and without making it into more than it was. October came in cool and golden, the way Texas fall arrives like a gift after the long cruelty of summer, and the land looked strong, and the cattle were in good condition, and the channel system that Nellie had planned and they had built together was still working exactly as it was supposed to. And one morning Nellie went to the wooden box above the fireplace and took out the folded piece of paper. She read it in the morning light, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, and she read it slowly, each of the 7 terms, and she thought about them, and about the months that had passed, and about the man who worked the land alongside her, and asked before he changed things, and waited when she said she needed to think, and stood at the fence post without being asked. And she understood something that she had been quietly understanding for some time, which was that the terms she had been written for him without her knowing it, the way sometimes you know the shape of something before you know what it is. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. She thought about it for a week, which was not a long time for Nellie Shelton when she was being careful, and she was always careful with things that mattered. She thought about it the way she thought about the channel system, identifying where the grade was right and where it needed adjusting, where the logic was sound, and where she was filling in what she wanted rather than what was real. And she kept coming back to the same conclusion, which was that she had observed this man for nearly 6 months, and her observations were consistent, and her reading of him was sound, and she was not a woman who second-guessed sound readings. On a Thursday evening in October after supper, when the dishes were cleared and the lamp was lit and the evening air coming through the open window was cool enough to be pleasant, she reached into her apron pocket and took out the folded paper and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it and then looked at her. "I would like you to read that," she said. "Take the time you need." He picked it up and unfolded it carefully, because it had been folded and unfolded many times and the creases were soft, and he began to read. He read slowly, which was the only way he ever read anything worth reading, and the lamplight fell on the paper and on his face, and Nellie sat across the table with her coffee cup and watched him. She had not realized, when she put the paper on the table, how much was riding on the next several minutes. She had thought she was approaching this calmly, practically, with the same measured clarity she brought to all decisions, but now that the paper was in his hands and he was reading it, she was aware that her heart was doing something it had no business doing given her general policy toward unnecessary dramatics, and she kept her hands wrapped around the coffee cup and kept her face composed. He read each term. He read them without rushing, without any visible reaction beyond the quality of his attention, which was the same quality he gave to everything worth attending to, complete and genuine and without performance. He reached the last term, "I will not be managed. I will be partnered," and he stayed on it for a moment longer than the others. Then he folded the paper carefully along its existing creases and he set it on the table between them. He looked at her. His face was very still in the lamplight, and there was something in his expression that was not carefully arranged, that was simply there, and she recognized it because she had been carrying its reflection for some weeks. "I can accept all of these," he said. She looked at him for a long, complete moment. Outside, the wind came through the grassland with the particular dry grass sound of a Texas October evening, and the cattle were settled and the fence lines were sound, and the channel ran correctly in the northern pasture, and the woman across the table from him had her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on him, and he was the most still he had ever been in his life. "You read them slowly," she said. "They deserve to be read slowly," he said. She set the coffee cup down. "There is a difference," she said carefully, "between a man who accepts terms because he wants something and a man who accepts terms because he understands them." "I know," he said. "Which are you?" He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table, and he did not look away. "I understand every term you wrote," he said. "I understand what they cost you to write and what they mean about what you have been through, and I understand that they are not negotiating positions. They are facts about who you are and how you need to live, and I would not change a single one of them even if I could." The silence after that was not an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that has weight and meaning, the kind that settles something. "I have not done this well in the past," she said, and she meant it simply, without self-pity. "I do not mean Thomas, who was a good man. I mean the way I have given myself over to arrangements without requiring the arrangement to account for me." "I see that in the terms," he said. "Then you understand that if this is a thing we are considering," she said, "it will go at my pace and on honest terms, and I will tell you plainly when something is wrong." "I would not want it any other way," he said, and he meant that too. She picked up the folded paper and slid it back across the table to him. "Keep that," she said. "So we both remember what was agreed." He took it and folded it once more and put it in his shirt pocket against his chest, and the gesture was so simple and so complete that she felt something in her chest unlock, quietly, like a latch that has been stuck for a long time and finally moves. "Well then," she said, and her voice was steady, though something behind her eyes was not quite so steady, something warm and a little uncertain in the way that new things are uncertain before they prove themselves. "I will put more coffee on." He almost smiled, which for Ezekiel Walker was the equivalent of another man laughing. "I would appreciate that," he said, and that was how it started. It was not fast, because it was not the kind of thing that ought to be fast. It was the careful and honest progression of two people who were paying attention to each other, who were learning the particular language of each other's silences and preferences and rhythms, and who were discovering, with the kind of quiet joy that does not announce itself but simply deepens, that the learning was not labor, that it was pleasure, that the other person was not a puzzle to be solved but a country to be explored, and that the exploration itself was the thing. He began to notice the details of her, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking through a problem, the way she hummed very quietly to herself when she was working alone and did not know she was doing it, the way she laughed, which was rare enough to be remarkable and genuine enough to make the rarity worthwhile. He noticed the way her face changed when she was in the northern pasture, and the cattle were healthy, and the water was running right, and everything was as it should be, a quality of quiet satisfaction that was the most unguarded thing she showed, the most purely herself. She began to notice the way he was careful with things, not just tools and fence lines but with words, the way he did not use more of them than the thing required, so that when he said something it meant exactly what it said. The way he was kind in ways he did not think of as kindness, practical care being, for him, the primary language of affection. The extra load of firewood stacked before she thought to ask, the fence post checked after a storm before she woke up, the small adjustments made always in consultation, and always after waiting for her to be ready. She noticed his hands, which were a working man's hands, scarred and calloused and capable, and which moved carefully when they were handling anything that could be damaged. In November, he took her hand for the first time. They were walking the eastern fence line on a cold morning, assessing what the first frost had done to the older posts, and she had paused to look at a section he had already noted, and she stepped, slightly, into the uneven ground, and his hand was there before he had consciously decided to offer it. And she took it and steadied herself and then did not let go immediately. And he did not let go either, and they walked a portion of the fence line that way in the cold November air, not saying anything about it. On the way back she looked at him sideways and said, "You are very patient." "With some things," he said. "With me," she clarified. "With you," he agreed. "Though patience is easy when the waiting is worthwhile." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I kissed a man once when I was 17 who told me afterward that I was too serious and it had not been what he expected, and I thought about that for years, about the way he said it like being serious was a failure." Ezekiel stopped walking and looked at her. "He was wrong," he said, "and there was not a single qualifier in it." She looked back at him, and the morning light was in her eyes and the cold had put color in her face. And she was 26 years old and standing in a field she had learned through grief and labor, and was beautiful in the particular way of things that are completely themselves, that have not been arranged for anyone's convenience. "Ezekiel," she said. "Yes," he said. She stepped toward him and kissed him, because she had written the terms and he had accepted them, and she was not a woman who waited for someone else to begin the thing she had decided to begin. It was a brief kiss, and it was entirely honest, and when it ended he was the one who was still, and she was the one who took a small step back and looked at him with that appraising attention that was one of the things he had come to love most about her. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. They walked back to the house. The morning was cold and clear, and the land stretched around them in every direction under the wide Texas sky, and everything that needed to be said had been said. The winter of 1882 settling into 1883 was the warmest winter either of them could remember, not in temperature, which was what it was, but in the quality of the days, which had acquired a particular richness that came from the two of them building something with intention and care. They worked the land. They planned for the spring. They sat by the fire in the evenings with the lamp and books and conversation that could go anywhere and did. Ezekiel had brought his small collection of books from his saddlebag, and she had her own shelves, and they discovered that their reading overlapped in some places and diverged in others, and both of these were productive. She read him passages, sometimes from a book on botany and irrigation, that she had acquired from the doctor's office after Clara Voss was done with it, and he would listen and occasionally offer observations from what he had seen on the land, and the conversation would go from irrigation to the history of water rights in Texas, which was contentious and complicated, to the ways in which the whole arrangement of land ownership in the West had been built on a series of displacements that neither of them could be fully comfortable with when they thought about it honestly. He had seen, during his cattle drive years, the ways in which the movement of cattle and settlers had pushed against and over the territories of people who had lived on the land for generations, the Comanche and others who had been systematically driven from what had been theirs, and he did not have comfortable words for any of it. Nellie had her own understanding of injustice, different in its particulars but not in its essential shape, and they talked about these things with the directness they brought to everything, without pretending the world was better than it was or that they were innocent of its structures simply by not having designed them. They did not resolve the big questions. You do not resolve the big questions at a kitchen table in the winter, but they sat with them honestly and together, and that was something. Clara Voss came to visit once in December, riding out to the property on a bright cold day, and she sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and the three of them talked for an hour about various things. And when she left she said to Nellie quietly on the porch, "He is exactly what he appears to be," and Nellie said, "I know," and Clara said, "Good." Those are rare, and rode away. In January, Ezekiel wrote to his sister in Waco. He had one surviving family member, a sister named Ruth, 2 years older than him, who had married a schoolteacher and lived a settled and decent life, and had been the consistent presence in his correspondence over the years of his wandering, the person who wrote back reliably and honestly, and told him the truth about himself when he needed it. He wrote to her about the land and the work, and then, at the end of the letter, about Nellie, and he tried to write about her the way you write about something real, without exaggerating and without understating, and he read the finished letter back to himself and thought it was the most honest thing he had written in a while. Ruth wrote back within 3 weeks, which was fast for a letter from Waco. She said the land situation sounded like good work. She said the woman he described sounded like someone worth paying careful attention to. She said, and he could hear her voice in every word of it, that she hoped he was not getting in his own way about it, which was the thing she always said when she thought he was overthinking something, and he folded the letter and smiled, which was not a common occurrence but felt exactly right in that moment. In February, he asked her if she would go with him to the spring social in town. He did not frame it as anything other than what it was, which was an invitation to go somewhere together in the way that people who are courting go somewhere together, and he asked her in the direct, plain way he asked everything and waited for her answer. She was quiet for a moment, and he knew she was not uncertain about him, but she was thinking about the town and the town's opinions, and he waited. "The town will have things to say," she said. "The town always has things to say," he agreed. "The question is whether it matters to you." She looked at him. "It does not matter to me," she said. "But I want to be clear about what going together means, so that we are not each meaning something different. I mean that I would like to take you to the social as the man who is courting you," he said, "and that I am not interested in concealing that or being subtle about it." Something in her face was quietly, deeply pleased by the plainness of this. "Then yes," she said, "I will go with you." The spring social was held in late March, in the open lot next to the church, with tables and lanterns and a fiddle player named Hector Alves, who had been playing at Raydrock Crossing events for 20 years and knew how to make a fiddle say something worth hearing. There were perhaps 40 people there, and every one of them had something to say with their eyes when Nellie Shelton arrived with Ezekiel Walker, and she met all of those glances with the same steady composure she brought to everything. And Ezekiel stood beside her and said hello to people he had gotten to know over the months through his work and his infrequent trips to town, and the evening moved the way such evenings do, in a current of small conversations and the smell of spring air and the sound of the fiddle. Old Jonas Pratt came over, the same man who had suggested remarrying some many months ago, and he looked at Nellie and then at Ezekiel with an expression that was trying to work out what to say, and Nellie said, pleasantly, "Good evening, Mr. Pratt," and then began a conversation about the expected spring rains that gave him no opening to say whatever he had been planning to say, and Ezekiel had to look away for a moment to keep his expression under control. Later, when the fiddle was playing something slower and couples were moving on the packed earth that served as a dance floor, Ezekiel held out his hand to her, and she looked at his hand and then at him. "I should warn you," she said, "that I am not a particularly graceful dancer." "I am not either," he said. "We will be equally ungraceful together." She took his hand and they danced, and it was not graceful in the way of people who have practiced dancing as an art, but it was genuine and easy, and she was aware of his hand at her waist, and the way the lamplight caught the straight line of his jaw, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had been right to trust her own observation. When the song ended and they stepped back from each other slightly, she said, "I wrote those terms for you." He looked at her. He had the folded paper still in his shirt pocket, had carried it there since the night she gave it to him. "I mean," she said, "that I wrote them without knowing who I was writing them for, but that every term was written for what you turned out to be." He took a slow breath. "Nellie," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if that is something you would consider." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight, surrounded by the sound of the fiddle and the hum of the town going about its evening, and she said, "I would like that too." And the thing in her chest that had been unlocking since October became, in that moment, fully and completely open. They were married in May of 1883, in the small church in Raydrock Crossing, on a morning that was warm without being hot and bright without being harsh, which seemed to both of them like the kind of weather you get when the world is paying attention. Clara Voss was there, wearing a dark green dress and looking pleased in a way she wore differently from most expressions, more genuine than her professional composure but equally composed. August Beeler from the general store was there. Hector Alves played a piece on his fiddle before the ceremony. Ruth Walker came from Waco, which had required a considerable journey, and she arrived 2 days before and spent those 2 days talking to Nellie with the frank and interested directness of a woman who wanted to understand what kind of person her brother had chosen. And by the end of the second day she had concluded and told Nellie directly that she was glad it was her. He needed someone who would not give way every time he went quiet, Ruth said, sitting at the kitchen table the evening before the wedding. He goes quiet a great deal, and he needs someone who understands that the quiet does not mean something is wrong. I know the difference between his thinking quiet and his troubled quiet, Nellie said. Ruth looked at her with a measuring attention that was clearly a family trait. Yes, she said, I can see that. The ceremony was short and honest. Reverend Caleb Ford, who was a young man with a genuine vocation and no interest in ceremony for its own sake, asked them the necessary questions and they answered them. And when he asked Ezekiel if he would have this woman, Ezekiel said, I will, with the quiet certainty of a man who does not say things he does not mean. And when he asked Nellie if she would have this man, she said, I will, with the clear and present completeness of a woman who has made her decision carefully and will not revisit it. Ezekiel slid the ring onto her finger. It was a simple gold band that he had made by the silversmith in Redrock Crossing, and she had told him when he asked about her preference that she did not want anything elaborate, that she wanted something that could be worn while working, and he had done exactly that. She looked at it on her finger and then looked at him, and her face was not a face that announced things loudly, but what was there was unmistakable. They walked out of the church into the May morning, and the few dozen people who had come were there in the churchyard with the particular warm noise of people who are genuinely glad for something. And Ruth was standing with Clara Voss, the two of them having discovered over the past 2 days that they liked each other, and both of them were looking at Nellie and Ezekiel with the expression of people who have witnessed something that has gone the way it was supposed to go. The reception was at the Shelton property, which was no longer only the Shelton property in practice, though Nellie had kept her name as she had written in her terms, and Ezekiel had never suggested otherwise. Tables were set outside in the spring air, and there was food and the fiddle, and the evening went late and warm and good. And when the last guests had gone home and Ruth had gone to sleep in the spare room and the night was down to just the two of them, and the lamp and the property that was theirs and the Texas sky above it full of stars, Nellie said, I think today was a good day. It was, he said. She leaned against him, which was a thing she had begun to do in the winter months, with the ease of someone discovering that being held is not the same as being managed, that there is a way of being close to someone that does not require giving anything away, and he put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch in the spring night, and it was quiet and complete. The following years were the kind of years that do not make for dramatic stories but make for good lives, which is a distinction worth making. They worked the land together, continued to improve it, and the operation grew in the slow, steady way of things built on solid ground rather than speculation. Nellie made the decisions about the herd with Ezekiel as her equal partner in the thinking, and when they disagreed, they argued it out plainly and arrived somewhere that was usually better than either of their starting positions, and neither of them kept score. The injustices of the world around them did not disappear. The dispossession of land and people that had made this whole enterprise possible was something they could not undo and could not be comfortable with either, and it was part of the moral weather of their lives in the way that hard truths often are for honest people, present and unresolved and carried. What they could do they did, which amounted mostly to being decent in the immediate ways that were available to them, in the ways they dealt with people, and in the choices they made about who they gave their business to and who they did not. In the summer of 1884, Nellie told Ezekiel that she was expecting, and he was very still for a moment in the particular way of someone receiving information that is both expected and astonishing. And then he said, "How are you feeling?" Which was the right question, and she said, "Tired and somewhat irritable and entirely fine," which was the right answer, and he nodded and asked if there was anything she needed from town, which was such a precise distillation of who he was that she almost laughed. "I do not need anything from town," she said. "I need you to not treat me as though I have suddenly become fragile." "I know," he said. "I will not." And he did not. He continued to work alongside her, adjusting without announcement for what the pregnancy required in terms of the heavier tasks, doing so in the practical silent way of a man who can see what is needed and does not require recognition for providing it, which was a thing she had always appreciated about him, and appreciated now with a new depth. Their son was born in March of 1885, on a cold morning when the frost was still on the ground, delivered by Clara Voss, who had been fetched at the first sign of labor, and who managed the whole thing with her characteristic competent calm. He was born healthy and loud, and Nellie held him with the expression of a woman who has been surprised by something she did not know she had been expecting, which was love of this particular and entirely overwhelming variety. They named him James, after Nellie's father, whose quiet decency she had always admired, with Walker as the family name his parents shared and Shelton as his middle name, so that the Shelton name that she had kept would also be carried forward, which was Ezekiel's idea and one she had loved immediately. James Walker Shelton turned out to be a serious and observant baby who became a serious and observant child, which should not have surprised either of them, but which delighted them both, because watching a small person develop the particular qualities of their parents and family and themselves is one of the great pleasures of being alive, and they were both paying close enough attention to see it happening and not take it for granted. Ruth came to visit after James was born and held the baby with the comfortable competence of a woman who had children of her own, and told Nellie he was very serious looking for a newborn, and Nellie said yes. He had come out that way. And they laughed together in the warm kitchen in the March cold, and Ezekiel sat across the table watching his wife and his sister and his son, and experienced something he did not have complete words for, but which was made up of gratitude and steadiness and love in roughly equal measure. In the years after, the property continued to grow. They hired a second hand in 1886, a young man named Domingo Reyes, who had come up from the border country and knew cattle as well as anyone Ezekiel had ever worked alongside, and who took to the operation with the same honest work that characterized everything that happened on that land. Nellie treated him as she treated everyone in her employ, which is to say with fairness and directness, and the expectation of work done well. And Domingo stayed for 3 years and left when he had enough saved to start his own small operation, which was exactly what she had told him when she hired him that she hoped the work would allow him to do. In the spring of 1887, Nellie was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy moved differently, heavier and more uncomfortable, and Clara Voss, when she examined her in June, said that she thought there might be more than one this time, and she was right. The following October, Nellie delivered twin girls, which Clara Voss described as the most efficiently she had ever seen the matter handled, and which Ezekiel received with an expression of sustained wonder that lasted several days. They named the girls Margaret and Frances, and they were not identical and were not similar in temperament, Margaret being loud and energetic, and relentlessly curious in a way that suggested she had decided very early that the world owed her its full attention, and Frances being quieter and watchful in the way that her father was watchful, taking things in with the full quality of her attention before acting on them. James, age 2, examined his sisters with the careful attention he applied to everything, and then said, with a solemnity that made both his parents work very hard not to laugh, "They are very small." "They are," Ezekiel agreed. "They will get larger." James considered this. "All right," he said, and went back to the wooden horse that Ruth had sent him from Waco. By the end of 1887, Nellie Shelton, Nellie Walker Shelton, as she had come to sign her name, both parts of who she was present together, sat at the kitchen table one December evening after the children were in bed, in the lamp-warm quiet of the house that had become something richer than she had imagined it could be. And she thought about the morning 5 years ago when she had sat at this same table with a pen and a piece of paper, and a certainty that she would not let the world write her terms for her again. She had not known then what the terms would produce. She had not known that the man who would read them slowly and say he could accept all of them would be a man she would love with this particular depth, this quality of genuine partnership that had only grown more itself with the years, more settled and more alive at the same time, the way good land gets better with good tending. She had not known that the land she had been holding onto by strength of will and determination would become, with two sets of hands working it in honest consultation, a genuinely flourishing operation that people in Calhoun County spoke of with respect. She had not known that there would be 3 children sleeping in the back rooms, a serious-faced boy who asked careful questions and twin daughters who were already, at 2 months old, showing signs of having inherited the best and most interesting things from both their parents. She heard Ezekiel come in from his last check on the animals, the particular sound of his boots on the porch, and the way the door handled itself when he came through it, careful even at the end of a long day. He came into the kitchen and she looked up at him, and he looked at her, and 5 years of mornings and evenings and hard work, an honest conversation and love that had grown from something careful and deliberate into something as natural and necessary as the water running in the northern pasture. All of it was present in the moment between them. He sat down across from her, as he had sat across from her the night she put the folded paper on the table, in the same lamplight, at the same table. "Children settled?" he asked. James argued briefly that he was not tired, she said. "He is definitely tired." "He is always tired by that hour and always argues it," Ezekiel said, with the warm affection of a father who is deeply familiar with his child. "He is very much like you," she said. "He is very much like you," he said. She smiled, which was still something he never took for granted. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way she had not done easily in the early months, the way she did now without thinking, because she had stopped thinking about it and started simply living it. "I was thinking," she said, "about that paper." He looked at her. He still had it, the original, folded into its soft creases, in the small box on his side of the dresser in their bedroom. He had moved it from his shirt pocket to the box the day they married, and it had been there since. "I was thinking," she said, "that I would write new terms." He raised an eyebrow slightly, just slightly, which was the equivalent for him of a significant reaction. "Not because the original ones were wrong," she said. "They were entirely right. But because I wrote them for a woman who was alone and protecting herself, and that woman has become someone who is, in addition to all those things, also," she paused, searching for the word that was accurate and not excessive, because she was still Nellie Shelton and she was not given to excess. "Also very glad," she said. "And I think that deserves to be written down too." He looked at her for a long moment, and in his face was everything that he was, the quietness and the care and the patience and the depth of feeling that he expressed not in grand declarations, but in fence posts checked after storms and papers kept in boxes and terms read slowly by lamplight and children named with both their parents in the name. "What would the new terms say?" he asked. She considered it. Outside, the December wind moved across the land they had built together, over the fence lines he had reinforced, and the channel system they had dug, and the pastures where their cattle were strong and settled for the winter, and the stars were doing what Texas stars do in December, which is being present in enormous uncountable numbers as though the sky is trying to say something about abundance. "That I'm still not to be managed," she said. "That has not changed." "It has not," he agreed. "That I still make my own decisions about this land and my part in it. Of course. That honest dealing is still the only kind I will accept. It is the only kind I offer." She looked at him, and her eyes were warm in the lamplight, and she was 31 years old and the most completely herself she had ever been, which was the most beautiful she had ever been. And he was 34, and he knew this and sat with the knowledge the way he sat with all things that mattered, quietly and completely. "And," she said, "that I am glad, that this is a good life, that you are a good man. That the whole of it, all of it, is better than anything I wrote on that paper because it is real and it is ours, and I did not know something could be this much what it was supposed to be." He did not say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same as it always was, steady and plain, but there was something under it that was not steady at all, that was very full. "I could accept those terms," he said. "Every single one." She squeezed his hand. He turned his hand over and held hers, the way he had since November of 1882 on the fence line in the cold that first time, when she had not let go immediately and neither had he. They sat like that in the lamp-warm kitchen, while the December wind moved over their land, and their children slept in the back rooms, and the stars came out over Texas in their uncountable numbers. And it was the end of a long and good day in a long and good life that they had built together, on honest terms with patient care, and it was complete. 6 years later, in the summer of 1893, James Walker Shelton was 8 years old and already apprenticing the land the way his father had apprenticed it, learning its grades and its water and its fence lines with the careful observation of someone who would one day know it as well as either of his parents. Margaret had decided, with the conviction she brought to everything, that she intended to be a doctor like Clara Voss, who had become a fixed and beloved presence in all their lives, and was already reading Clara's medical books with a focus that suggested she was not joking. Frances had taken to the cattle with a quiet competence that mirrored her father so precisely that it still made both of them quietly astonished to observe it. The land was strong and the family was strong, and Nellie stood at the edge of the northern pasture one August morning, the same pasture where the water ran through the channel she had planned and he had helped her build, and she watched her children and her husband moving through the morning's work, each of them distinct and present, each of them fully themselves, and she thought about the woman who had sat at the kitchen table with a pen and an inkwell and decided she would not be written for any more. That woman was still here. She was still every one of those 7 terms. She was also this, the fullness of a life that had been built on them, and she would not trade a single morning of it. Ezekiel came to stand beside her, as he often came to stand beside her when they had a moment of stillness in the middle of a working day, not needing to say anything, just being beside her in the way of people who have chosen each other over and over through all the ordinary days and are still choosing, still glad. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. They watched the land and the children and the water running clean and right through the pasture, and the August sky enormous above it all, and it was exactly, precisely, what it was supposed to be.